Vancouver really took off in about 1907, and there was a huge worldwide building boom up until 1913, then everything collapsed. So all these old, what you call heritage houses today, almost all of them in Grandview, Mount Pleasant, Kitsilano, they're all built, almost all built then. In the early years, they'd build this, guy would build a small house for himself. A lot of them were carpenters, they just build a house for themselves. And maybe at the back of the lot or at the front of the lot. And then later on, because these lots are 120 feet long, they would move the house to the back and get married, let's say, and have kids and build a big house at the front of the lot. Quite often you had grandparents that came over, like all at once, and all lived together in a house. So it wouldn't be unusual back then, especially when you got 12 kids or 10 kids, that was normal, that you might have the grandparents, I guess, living in the cottage in the back, and in the front you'd have, 5 kids and parents.
The way houses were built 100 years ago, the lots were so much more permeable visually. It was so much more of a shared landscape because the fences were lower. The houses had front porches. People hung their laundry out at the back. People tended to live more outdoors and so on. And so perhaps children would play in the lanes, or they would be playing on the streets, or they would be going back and forth.
The Laneway house itself is an evolution of a building form that's been done in the city for multiple years. So you could build infill or larger laneway houses, as they're called now, in many of the historic areas, heritage neighborhoods like Mount Pleasant or Kitsilano or Strathcona. The laneway has helped or evolved to help preserve existing buildings, or when new buildings are built, it's providing more of an opportunity to create some affordable or rental housing.
Laneway houses were never common in Vancouver, but there were enough of them around that you can track the places where they were, and particularly in the oldest neighborhoods of Vancouver, in Strathcona. They were the most common of all in Strathcona, because Strathcona was an absolute free-for-all, small-scale, greedy capitalism at its best, where people would they'd buy a lot and they'd just say, how many houses can I put on this lot? And so you can see that often in the case of 2 or 3 houses jammed in, or often you'll have a main house and then a little house on the lane, something like a granny cottage, a granny flat. All the little guys, all the speculators and everything created these wonderfully cool neighborhoods like Grandview that are, really made it into the kind of vibrant, artsy, politically hip community that it is.
I've always really liked urban areas and little infill projects that people do in urban settings. So I traveled a lot when I was younger, and you'd be in places, whether it was in Asia or Europe. And it was always sort of those little back alleys that you would find these really charming, created environments. When I moved to Vancouver around 2000, and I was working in older areas of the city doing renovation work, and there'd be those little houses and little cottages that were sort of starter homes for people back 120 years ago, 100 years ago. It really caught my imagination that if Vancouver was going to grow, which it was under a lot of pressure to do, this was going to be a way to really keep the texture of the communities and at the same time create more housing stock.
Yeah, the lane houses have been named as a gentle densification of neighborhoods. That was Michael Geller's term. Michael Geller, the architect and pundit and the developer in his own right, and yeah, obviously an idea that is really working for some people.
Close to 4 years ago, we heard that laneway houses were a possibility. At the time, we had a cement pad that sat four cars could park there, and we had 2 cars, so that didn't make a lot of sense, and it seemed like such a waste having a big cement pad in the back. So we were contemplating putting a garage in, maybe expanding it with just grass so the kids could play. Then when we heard about the Laneway house, we started looking into that and thought it was a great idea as a potential investment property. At the time, there was one main group advocating for it, Smallworks, and we were able to talk to them, sit down with them, and came up with some plans, and it just basically went from there.
When we talk about green spaces and use of space, David's house is a great example. You have this small residence that houses a family very effectively, and we were able to create another small residence that housed a family. In fact, the people who moved in there quite shortly afterwards had a child, which was great to see this young family have this opportunity. And then creating a courtyard between the 2 buildings where one could quite easily imagine a very safe play area for these families to have.
It's definitely not something you would do for short-term investment. It's a long-term investment. Definitely something you don't do to make money off right off the bat. It basically, more or less pays for itself, almost. And that's what I looked at it for, was just a long-term investment. So perhaps after it is paid off, it might be a small, modest little income, or maybe by that time my kids will be able to move into it, or even my kids actually might kick mom and dad out, and we might actually end up living there at some point in the future. We went through a few designs that Smallworks had, and this one was the most, that seemed to fit our profile the most with our house. Our house is about 70 years old, so we wanted something that didn't look modern. We wanted something that was more of a classic type look, so we went with a carriage style house, and we think it fits in quite well with the neighborhood and fits in well with Grandview-Woodlands. My opinion is, let's keep what's here, let's keep the heritage here, and Laneway helps to provide that. We can create some densification, but in addition, keep the existing homes and the existing heritage there. So we think it's a perfect fit for the city of Vancouver, rather than tearing everything down, putting in new condos, and we lose a lot of the history in Vancouver.
I think people recognize the value of heritage houses and the fact that we have really good housing stock that's been taken down almost every day in Vancouver, and this is a way to mitigate that. The biggest change we've seen with Laneway housing is that it's captured people's imagination around living small. I think there is a fundamental sea change happening within both urban planners and developers, but more importantly, I think it's really driven by a need and a kind of a new wave in the populace.
I think having great big monster homes will start to go away for a lot of different reasons here in Vancouver. First of all, the affordability of them. To afford any house in Vancouver is getting to be cost prohibitive for most people. So smaller homes make a lot more sense.
When you start looking at land that's set aside for car, which includes laneways, people's front yards to some extent, and certainly roadways, the car owns a big proportion of the single-family neighborhood, well into the 40%.
If you get back to say, well, how do we design cities for people instead of cars? What you do is you downplay everything to do with cars and you upplay people. What works is a lot of interactions and diversity.
I think a lot of people that have Laneway houses, it's, we sometimes believe in something a little bit different. We're not car-centric ourselves, our family. A lot of us cycle quite a bit, so we try and limit the amount of cars we have on the property. Once I moved over here, I really started to feel a sense of community, people getting together all the time for barbecues, the occasional block party. So it's definitely changed the landscape, I think.
Looking ahead, in kind of an ideal way, it may not unfold this way, but ideal way, we'd love to see a number of these lanes that we have in the city in key areas become much more of public muses. The laneways are this way to kind of create a really lovely landscape that's atypical from what we have now, which facilitates a shift in our value system that we're seeing reflected in other green initiatives.